Good morning. We're about to begin. I want to, when you're finished, come on over and join us. I want to thank you for coming today to a discussion about a topic that receives short shrift here in Washington. It is, and when it is talked about, it is talked about in a way to score points and not solve problems. We're delighted to have with us today Father Simon Faddoul. He's the president of Caritas in Lebanon. It's the Catholic Relief Society in Lebanon that is focused right now on aiding Iraqi and Syrian refugees who've come to Lebanon as a result of conflict in their countries. He's a pastor, a distinguished career in the Maronite Church, has a doctorate in educational administration and leadership from the University of Cincinnati, and he is a neighbor of my family in Ernest Shahwan in Lebanon. He's in the States on a speaking tour and has graciously honored us with his presence. Following him will be Qamar-ul Huda, who's the senior program officer in religion and peacemaking and a scholar of Islam at the U.S. Institute for Peace. He edited the U.S. Institute for Peace book, The Crescent and Dove, Peace and Conflict Resolution in Islam. And then I will make some closing remarks. I'm James Zogby, and I'm president of the Arab American Institute. I'm going to turn the over right now to Father Faddoul.
Good morning to all. Thank you, James. Thank you for this opportunity to address you today. I come from Lebanon, from a place that has witnessed so many problems and turmoils along the years, especially the last 3-4 decades. But now, apparently, it's a kind of a safe haven for so many around us, especially in Syria and Iraq, who are fleeing to Lebanon, asking for refuge, and we're trying to reach out to all. My talk will be focusing mainly on the plight of the Christians of the area in the light of the last happenings, beginning with the Iraqi war and ending now with what's happening in Syria. Undoubtedly that the area is at a crossroads. So far, major changes brought forward by the Arab Spring haven't been up to people's expectations and hopes, or rather have aroused many concerns and brought along great fears, especially for the Christian communities who have been there 600 years before the birth of Islam. In fact, all peoples, not only Christians, are having second thoughts on the current happenings, despite the longing of all to see more democratic political regimes and better performing governments take place in the Middle East, North Africa region. Many around the world can't help but raise critical questions around the future in the light of the present. Would the changes be democratic in the conventional meaning of the term, or would they cause a more fundamental Islamic ascent in the region? Haven't we all witnessed the strong emergence in Egypt, not only of the Muslim Brotherhood, but also of the Salafites, who are even at the harsher extreme? What about the election of the Islamic Party in Tunisia, and the call for the law of Sharia in Libya, and the Iraqi scene in all its dimensions, and what has been taking place in Syria, and etc.? These aren't but some living examples. In the light of all those happenings, some very crucial questions are frequently asked by all citizens of the area, and by Christians in particular. What and how would our future be? Can our children dream of a better tomorrow? What role do the moderate Muslims have to play to help maintain the Christian presence in the area? Could the universal and local churches still affect people's lives? Is the church leadership aware of the gravity of the matter? What's being done to reassure the faithful of a better tomorrow? What role would humanitarian and social development organizations have to play to face the current demoralizing situation and turn problems into challenges? On the political front, a question that is haunting all spirits: have Western, American and European in particular, interferences contributed in bringing about peace, or have they been instrumental in making things worse? The decades have witnessed retaliation from fundamentalists against local churches and Christians because they perceive Western political interferences as a sort of crusades. In short, Christians in the MENA have been paying the price in reference to their religious belonging and to international politics as well. This is not new to the area, since the Arab countries haven't abided by the UN Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18 of December 1948, which states that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Instead, they have always persecuted, directly or indirectly, the Christian minority since well before the rule of the Ottoman Empire. In the current situation, even moderate Muslims have to start worrying about their future, since fundamentalists have proven to be exclusionist. They cannot accept cultural differences, neither can they tolerate opinions that do not agree with their beliefs. In terms of statistics, no official census, reliable census has been made in the Middle East and North Africa countries. However, the cradle of Christianity in the Middle East is being emptied of its Christians, who out of fear and despair are leaving their respective countries massively. Just in a very short way, I give you a few figures. The Holy Land, birthplace of Jesus Christ and Christianity, has only a few thousand Christians remain there, and many of whom are looking for a better life condition elsewhere to relocate. The last estimate given by a church official in Jerusalem is 25,000 faithful. Egypt, no one can tell the exact figure of Egyptian Christians, especially Copts. Even their church can't. About 40 years ago, I was a kid, the number was around 8 million. Now some say it is up to 15. Government officials say it's about 6 million only. They decrease. The number mentioned during Pope Shenouda's funeral last month was 12 million. They have always been treated as second-class citizens. In Iraq, where 1.4 million Christians lived till 2003, the date of the invasion, is now left with only about 400,000, as per the Assyrian International News Agency, INA, many of whom has escaped to the northern part of the country, Kurdistan, or is awaiting a proper escape to a western country, and many have come to neighboring countries, especially Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. As if this isn't enough for them, many of those who have migrated to Western countries, especially in Europe, Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands, etc., have been undergoing all sorts of cultural, social, and political pressures to the point of deportation back to Iraq to face a fatal fate. In Lebanon, due to repeated wars and political instability, and although it is the only Arab country where Christians have enough freedom and could be high positioned in the government, has lost well over 500,000 of its Christians during the last 20 years. They make up, based on official statistics, they make up about 33% of the population, which means over 1 million people. Taken into consideration that out of the 4 million people living in Lebanon, you have about 800,000 refugees and migrant workers. We have 500,000 Palestinian refugees only. And then we have about 20,000 Iraqi refugees, and now with the Syrian refugees, and we have about 200,000 migrant worker population. Migrant workers, domestic workers. Syria's Christian population is estimated at around 9% of the 19 million people in Syria. Although they have known a relative stability during the Assad regime, many of them have already fled the country. With the current situation, every predictive analysis foresees a huge wave of Christian migration coming along. Iran pretends to allowing the Christian minority a certain freedom, but the community that has lost its two-thirds already lives on a borrowed time, not knowing what tomorrow will bring along. I'll not continue, certainly, to talk about other countries, but anyway, the Synod for the Christians of the Middle East convened in Rome in October 2010 called on all nations, lobbying groups, Christian and social NGOs to play a role in helping Christians remain in their lands where their presence has become one of true witness. How this would be possible and on what basis? My response to this question would be of three folds: political lobbying, rising collective self-esteem, and developing a shared vision to all Christians of the area so their efforts converge in the same direction. A. Political lobbying. Middle East nationals, Christians and Muslims alike, living in the Middle East and MENA region or in the Western world are faced with a real challenge. We have to make this our cause and lobby beside the governments of the USA and the free world in favor of looking beyond the political and economic interests and gains so Christians could be helped to remain in their lands. I'd say Christians and Muslims alike, because without Christians, the area will lose its true identity and will be turned into clusters and ghettos where exclusion instead of inclusion becomes the norm. I believe the US has a major role to play using its political might and influence to help Arab nations focus on citizenship and civic engagement rather than religious belonging. B. The rising collective self-esteem. Christians of the MENA are citizens of the land. They have to live their citizenship to the fullest, act assertively, interact with others on an equal basis as citizens rather than believers against other believers. They have the right to plan ahead, to dream of a better tomorrow, and to work on making their dreams come true. Such an attitude could see the light if we are willing to change our speech and our way of thinking. Why should we continue weeping and nagging? Why don't we make an effort to get out of our inferiority and minority and the persecution complexes so we could reach out horizontally? We need to help Christians rise their self-esteem, their self-image, so they could look ahead, so they refuse the status quo, and they impose another that could be more suitable to all citizens regardless of their religious belonging. C. Common and shared vision. Christians of the area have grown quite apart. The Lebanese feel superior because of the little freedom they enjoy. The Copts know they make up the majority of the Christians, but they have lived too long as second-class citizens. They forgot how or are scared of taking the initiative. The others in other countries feel outcasted and marginalized. They are happy of being left alone, so their existence won't be endangered. In the midst of the war in Iraq, and while thousands of Christians were being persecuted and fleeing the country, different church officials couldn't agree on one common plan on how to stand up together and face the challenges. They rather fought on whom should represent the Iraqi church and who's going to head the committee or that task force, etc., etc. The same could be said about Lebanon churches, although all Christians of the area look at them with hopeful eyes, since it is the only place where Christian voice can be loudly heard. What we need is a unifying, visionary church leadership, a leadership who can bring all peoples together and work on one common and shared vision for all Christian communities. It is about time Christians start thinking strategically, using their full potential to turn time on their side and put reachable objectives that will allow them to stick together and work for the same cause. Final, in a world increasingly growing apart, a new kind of apostolate is needed. Everyone has to get involved. Everyone has to feel responsible and contribute in making the situation not merely more bearable, but also and especially more promising for the MENA Christians. Whether you're Christian Muslim, Jew, or any sort of believer, religious or non-religious, you need to feel concerned. You need to fight against misfortune, mistreatment, persecution, exclusion, and inferiority. Lobbying groups and government officials have to address this issue wholeheartedly and without hesitation. We all need to raise our voices in official settings, as well as in universities, churches, temples, mosques, streets, and everywhere, so all people of the area can live in peace and can enjoy social justice. Shouldn't we all uphold the word-recognized norms and standards that regulate the lives of peoples of different cultures and background, so they could live together in peace and harmony and complementarity? Norms such as respect for the human person, the critical sense which allows to choose life over death and right over wrong, the personal freedom which supposes an upright conscience and an illumined faith, and the acceptance of plurality which upholds human dignity and rights and refuses any kind of exclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the Arab American Institute for this opportunity to speak. My name is Qamar-ul Huda of the U.S. Institute of Peace. I have a few comments and questions on the subject, and hopefully we can discuss in detail our Q&A. And my task was really to speak about Christian-Muslim relations in the Middle East and its growing tensions between the two communities, given the tsunami of changes in the past year or so. Before addressing that, or as I'm addressing that, I think I respect Father's recent comments. I think I agree with him in almost every word. There's some nuances I think that I hold, and is whenever there is conflict or changes or social changes, it's interesting how identities are shrunk or reduced to religious identities or ethnic identities. For most of post-independence Middle East and North Africa region, people did and still view themselves as Egyptians, Lebanese, or Syrian, and so forth. And now with these latest changes, we see more and more people first saying, I'm Muslim, I'm Christian, I am so forth and so forth. And I think this is an important thing to think of in terms of conflict and the way religion is used, manipulated, and used and manufactured to advance certain agendas. So that's one point, I think, is the sort of manipulation of religion and religious forces, whether it be in the Arab Spring, quote unquote, or in the post-Arab Spring. How religion is used as a way of, as identity, as a social reality, and as a way to propose a new vision in the future. And we have several different visions, but I do want to say a few words on that there is a foundation of a very good interfaith relations that never been covered or have been really neglected in the region. Just in the region in Syria, the former Grand Mufti Ahmed Kaftaro used to speak very strongly for interfaith relations, and for 50 years he was viewed as this important symbol, and he trained all of his students and scholars in interfaith relations. And anyone who had visited him in Syria, you would always see Christians in his office involved in interfaith relations. The current Grand Mufti of Egypt, Sheikh Ali Guma, has made several comments and has laid down a great foundation for interfaith relations, and led the way in many ways that are incomparable in other parts of Muslim majority countries. But all of this said, we do have a new period, a period of thinking about relations, as Rashid Al-Ghannouchi has said 3 weeks ago, a new secularism. A secularism that I think he's been writing for about 20 years, but now it's coming into a political reality, that one's faith is personal faith. And for someone of his stature to write a new secularism for Muslims and Islamists is very revolutionary in his own thinking and his own writing. Based on human rights, he wrote and spoke about, based on minority rights, based on universal rights, and a democratic institution. So I think what we're seeing is various countries, various figures trying to forge something new. Now, I'm not trying to paint a rosy picture. I'm just saying there's some foundations that interfaith relations can build upon. It's not an abyss where there's nothing to do and nowhere to meet. And I think there has been many places of incredible work that's been done by these scholars. But I don't want to suggest that interfaith relations between Christian, Muslims, and Jews in this area is top heavy. There's a lot of stuff on the ground, as your organization does, and lead on mediation, faith-based organizations leading, using work on conflict resolution, conflict prevention. As much as this interfaith work, one has to really be critical of the lack of steam it's received in the last 20 years. So this is my criticism, based on my own work, is that even though we've sponsored many conferences and workshops and so forth, interfaith work has been, because of the previous political systems, really controlled by the state. It was very common to see people from Mukhabarat, the intelligence groups and the military and so forth present at our interfaith meetings. It's very common to see the state saying interfaith is not an important project or an enterprise. What's more important is our national identity. We are first Egyptian, we are first Lebanese, and all this other stuff comes later. And the point was that the state was very much involved or interested in preserving any schisms between various groups. Given that, I think interfaith work and dialogue had moved very incrementally. And now is the time I think they can do all the work that the Father had presented. There's a lot more space to do it. But unfortunately, what comes in the press is the very negative things, that there's nothing else happening. And there's churches are being burned, mosques are being burned, and there's threats to the leadership. I think aside from that reality, there is a parallel reality of good relations already happening. The other thing I put as an important project to examine, as much as interfaith Christian, Muslim, Jewish relations is something to examine, we really need to examine first intrafaith, the relations between Christians within the region and the international influences of those relationships. Same with Muslim and within Muslim relations. We find just in Egypt the rise of Salafis, the rise of outside influences on the Salafis and on the Ikhwan and Muslim Brotherhood, as well as all these other moderate groups and secular Muslims. All of these international forces have made an impact on the various relationships within that faith. And I think that's one in fact that we need to explore, that there is very little space within each tradition to sometimes really be honest about the issues at hand, not just the institutions, not just the churches that are being, of course, burnt, and the refugees and so forth. But as the Father said, this just coming to an agreement and a consensus on a particular issue. So I think that's an important issue, is that the leadership of the different traditions have really not stepped up to discuss their own internal matters and their own laundry list of things to correct. One thing I would point out, I know my time is short, is that 3 years ago there was an incredible event. 400 Muslim scholars of all the different Islamic sects had come and written a letter to Christians. It's called the Common Word. It was sent out and established in Jordan, Amman, Jordan, by the royal family. And what happened since then is there were 4 or 5 major meetings of the Common Word between 600 or plus religious leaders, both Christians and Muslims, on high-level stuff. And the problem that while there was a great movement, and we haven't seen that in centuries, of that level of meetings, it was a meeting in Georgetown, a meeting at Yale, a meeting at Cambridge, and the Vatican, and so forth. We saw high-level theological work, but it never really translated anything on the ground, or translated anything back to the local churches or mosques. What we have to do is move from that top-level work to the faith-based organizations, to local institutions. And I believe that we need to examine our efforts, interfaith work. What works, what doesn't? What interfaith programs have succeeded, and quote-unquote, and why have they failed? What lessons can we learn? Why is it in our institutions, both Muslim institutions and Christian institutions, do we have very little interfaith programs? world religion programs. We share common heritage and common history, if not common scripture. Why do we have very little courses taught in our own institutions? We need to examine that. We also need to examine that within our training of religious leaders or in seminaries, there's very little understanding of the other. Not only just Islamic or Christian, but within each other. I found that Muslims know very little about other Muslim groups, and the same holds for Christianity. So I think, as well as interfaith, we really need to think about interfaith issues. In the course of all these issues of dealing with conflict that rides like a roller coaster, we forget that identity shrinks, and the thinking of one's identity comes down to some basic religious identity, and that's the root cause, and sometimes people assume it's a religious conflict. I think we should be very cautious thinking that way. I think on the ground it's common to feel that way based on the fears and the problems of the future and the problems of the current. But I think we do need to be cautious and think about the power of religious symbols and religious acts and religious ceremonies and the common heritage that brings and it lay down a real foundation for serious a new vision of interfaith activities. Those are my comments for now. Thank you.
I have just a few comments, observations of my own, and then we'll open it for questions and answers. The first observation I want to make is the degree to which we have responsibility here. We've operated in the region. I say like nearsighted men in a darkened room, but worse than that. It's not just that we don't see, but it's that we are usually convinced by ideology that we know. So we're operating in the Middle East in countries we have no idea about, don't know their history, don't know their culture, don't know the characteristics of their people, and we are unleashing that can be transformative. The Iraq War, for example, was an enormous trauma that we brought on the region with no idea whatsoever of what the consequences would be. And yet we blindly stumbled in, wreaked havoc, and then when, in fact, the disaster unfolded, we blamed it on the furniture being in the way. And they were dead-enders doing it, or something or other that created the problem. I've been asked by folks every time I speak about this, but wasn't it worth it? That's the American sense. We have to think that it's always worth it. If you look at the country, 1/5 of the population are refugees or internally displaced people. They can never go home. 1/5 of the population of the country. The number of dead we will never know, basically because we didn't count them like we counted us. And in fact, there were orders not to present counts of Iraqi dead, so we just don't know. 100,000 minimum, but who knows what beyond. And a country today divided in a way that it probably never will come back again as a unified whole. And I must say, not worth it. I have to say, not worth it. The trauma was too great. The cost was too huge for the people of that country to bear. And the problem is that the same situation is at our doorstep again in Syria. I mean, I saw the picture today of Joe Lieberman and John McCain with the Syrian opposition. They have no idea who they're talking to. They have no idea what the guys they're talking to are all about. I find the Assad regime horrific, but I wasn't kissing up to them like some people here were years ago. But I'm also aware that armed intervention or an American involvement, going into a country whose history and culture you do not understand, performing an act of surgery, the consequences of which you don't understand, it is a recipe for disaster. And yet it appears that we're moving in that direction again. Libya was a kind of an easy case for some folks, but look on the ground in Libya today, and you have to ask yourself, what are we responsible for there? I mean, the folks who won are committing atrocities in the country. We don't even know what they're doing because we're not reporting on it. It's not our story anymore. It's their story now. This is not to say that there isn't an American role, but it must be a thoughtful role. It must be a role that takes into consideration the lives of the people that we're going to be ultimately responsible for when we create these situations that they will live with the consequences of, and we will not. It's not a problem of one administration. It's a problem that travels throughout our history, and is no less a problem today than it was in the first 8 years of this century. The mistakes we've made, we continue to make. Just two observations about religion. The first point I wanted to make initially, in other words, is our responsibility. Our responsibility to understand before we act. And the criticism that we oftentimes do not understand, and therefore the consequences can be devastating. But now the other 2 points are both about citizenship and about minorities in the region. I want to commend Father on that observation, that we're not talking about minority rights. And that's something that I think this administration simply hasn't understood either. I mean, the president's speech in Cairo, as marvelous a new chapter as it was in terms of opening a discussion, the only point at which he introduced Christians into the discussion was to advocate for minority rights. We're not talking about minority rights. Minority rights in effect means you are a subordinate people in the countries in which you are a minority. We're not talking about tolerance. We're talking about full citizenship rights. And Father used that word, and it's an important word. It's an important word to recognize. But I don't think it's yet dawned on those who have the political discussion in the United States what advocating full citizenship rights would mean. What it would mean for a discussion in Egypt to be about full citizenship rights for all of the Egyptian people. And not a question of, okay, we'll tolerate and protect and maintain you as a minority community in the country, but we're dealing with these other guys right now. And the final point about this issue of religion is that the danger that those who have been advocates for religious freedom in this country have discredited themselves by using it as an ideological club. I remember when I first came to Washington back in the 1970s, I ran a human rights group. We dealt with Palestinian human rights. There were groups who would talk to us, and then there were groups who wouldn't. There were groups at the time, human rights groups from the left. They dealt with every country in the world that was not in the Soviet bloc, or that was not an ally of the Soviet Union. And then there were those groups that dealt with human rights from the right. And they would deal only with human rights in the Soviet Union or in the allies of the Soviet Union, but wouldn't talk about anybody else. And usually the litmus test was who would talk about Palestinian human rights and who would talk about Cuban human rights. And you could usually discern which bloc they were with. I mean, the human rights community was as divided as the Cold War its debate itself. We're in the same situation today. You have groups who are defenders of Christians in the Middle East everywhere but Christians in Israel. The Arab Christian community in Israel. Won't talk about it, doesn't exist for them. They now want to get rid of Bashar al-Assad. They wanted to get rid of Saddam Hussein. But the Christian communities in Iraq and Syria are paying the price for their ideological bent. Should that mean that we defend Saddam and Bashar al-Assad? Of course not. But it means we got to be aware of what we're doing and talking about and be consistent in our concern for religious freedom. And we're not. And then you have the other side, the guys who will defend human rights everywhere but in Arab countries, for example, where they don't want to talk about the absence of religious freedom in the Arab world, and it's a problem. And so the issue is the difficult need to be consistent in advocating for religious freedom. And it's something we haven't done, which is why the Commission on International Religious Freedom has thoroughly discredited itself over the years. It's been an ideological club, and I don't mean a club, a gathering. I mean a blunt, a hammer to be used against enemies of their form of politics, and that has not helped advance religious freedom. It's actually made religious freedom and the cause of religious freedom a questionable political tool, and people look at it and say, I know what their game is. They're advocating against the regime, or they're advocating for this, and that has not been, that shouldn't be what those of us who advocate religious freedom are known to be. We should not be seen as people from the right or people from the left, but we should be seen as people who are advocating human rights for everybody. Now, I'm going to end there, and we will move to the table, and we will take questions. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes, sir. Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about how the Christian political establishment in Lebanon is seeing the Syrian conflict? I know some years ago, said we don't like the regime, the Islamists aren't going to kill the Christians and kick them out. We're getting into the regime forever, we should be opposing them. Aoun said, the regime, we need them to protect Christians. How is that?
Well, there are certainly, politically, there are split. The split is because of their political belonging. It's as simple as this to begin with. Since a few years, since 2005, there has been a division. People are sided with the Syrian regime, and other people side against the regime. And I think it's continuing in that respect. However, what's added is that the human and the humane aspect of the situation, I think nobody has been able to overcome what's going on and the pain and the plight of the people, regardless of their religious belonging, affiliation. So whether it's Muslim or Christian or Arabic or wherever, killing is killing, and the victims, are injured, displaced, whatever. So the political establishment is quite divided. However, we and now I'm talking in my capacity as president of Caritas Lebanon, which is equivalent to the Catholic Charities here in the States, our job has been to side with the people in pain, the suffering people. And that's why we have started working with them since early on, and when they first fled to northern part of Lebanon, and then later on to the eastern part in the Bekaa Valley, and we have been there next to them. We're trying to do our best to ease the pain as much as we could, because it's been really terrible. I cannot start to tell you some of the stories I heard myself, because I made a couple of field visits, and I saw Muslims and Christians alike. It's very terrible situation. Certainly in this, the weakest point, or the weakest party in this thing are the Christians, because they can neither side with the opposition nor with the regime, and even they cannot be in the middle, because they are blamed by both parties for not taking a side. So it's a very difficult situation, very critical one, and that's why I think we are facing the unknown, and this is the most horrible thing.
Just introduce yourself before you ask the question. Yeah, appreciate it. Anyone else?
I have a comment, not a question.
Yes. Who are you?
My name is Sam Faddoul. I am United States citizen. I mean, naturalized. Originally, I'm from Damascus, Syria. Lived there all my life.
Yeah.
I have a comment on, on what you're talking about. The problem is not religious. you are hitting it from the religious point of view. I totally agree with Mr. Zogby. But I worked and lived there, and I know what I'm talking about. You know, in 1920, 25, Syria, Greater Syria was, after the Ottoman Empire left, was full of people, immigrants from all over the region, Christian, Muslim, Kurds, I don't know, Hindustanis, you can name them, and they are there. And they always went to the most prosperous area. It happened to be Syria because it's a nice country, which is also Lebanon and Jordan and Palestine. Now the West, when they started dividing these countries, of course they had different ideas in our region. So they started creating labels, creating problems. And these problems that were created resulted in tumors. And those tumors were beneficial to the West. And they kept them there and they nurtured them. Till at one stage, those tumors, which is like cancer in the body, became too much to bear in the West. So they started to extract that as roots. And this is the problems we are experiencing now. I have a story to tell, just a few minutes, but you look how things are. We had a minister of finance. In 1925, the French were ruling Syria. And what do you call it? The High Commissioner of France was called General Gouraud, if you are familiar with history. And he started persecuting even the Christians because they were anti-French. So one finance minister went to the Umayyad Mosque, which is the largest mosque in Damascus. Originally it was a church that became a mosque. And he went to the main culprit and talked. And he says, I'm Christian, but if the French wants to kick me out, I'm becoming a Christian Muslim. And everybody, of course, held him, they put him on their shoulders, and they went out in the demonstration. This shows you that even from the 20s, the unity between Christians and Muslims existed. Now, today, it's a problem. It was never a problem. Who created it? It's just, something.
Let me stop you there, brother. Do you want to come in on that?
Yes.
And then, sure.
I just want to say, there is maybe a lot of truth in what you're saying, but I think we have to move beyond that in terms of who created what, and say one thing. My personal experience on the field, in real life, there is no problem whatsoever between Muslims and Christians and whatever. I am a university professor. I taught at the American University, at the Lebanese University. Most of my students were Muslims, not Christians, and I'm a priest. I had no problem. I have trained all the school principals of the Hezbollah schools and the Amal schools and the Hariri schools. I had never a problem. We do interact. We have friendship. I think in that respect, the politicians, not only the international powers, but also the local politicians have played a negative role in that they have exploited their religious affiliation to their own benefit by really igniting, problems among the people. But I think at the moment, at present, there is a real danger in that what wasn't present in the past, it is present now, which are the very fundamentalist and extremist movements that are making the difference. And here I think we need to get together, mobilize our forces together, Christians and Muslims alike, and all faithful of all faith-related communities, as really in our mature and modern understanding of the faith, so that we could really form a coalition and base this coalition on our citizenship, not on our religious belonging. And this is what I'm personally convinced in. If I am dealt with, and I think Mr. Zogby complimented, if I am dealt with as a Lebanese, I feel much better than as a Maronite. Although I'm very proud of being a Maronite. You see what I mean? If I'm dealt with as a Sunni, I don't feel as good as when I'm dealt with as a Lebanese. So when we start dealing with one another as citizens of the land, and this is the right of each citizen to be dealt with in this capacity, then we could overcome our problems. Here, I think the role of the lobbying groups, beside the governments and the powers, in the world, to try to shift the attention from immediate gain and interests because I have, personal financial gain in this or a petrol or whatever it is, and really look at the destiny of the people. And this is, I think, if we could move in that direction, then we can make a difference in our lives and in other people's lives.
Said it so succinctly. There's not much to add, but to say that the ownership of one's issues and problems and conflicts. I mean, how much and how long can we turn in history and say it started here at this point and that point? I think it deflects the issue of personal contributions to it and our own communities to it. So there needs to be a 12-step detox program of stop wasting time and saying it was them, it's the Iranians, it's the American evangelicals. Yes, acknowledge and assess what's happening, but also acknowledge how the communities and the leaders, as you said, and their own personal involvement in dividing these communities. And I think that's very important. We have to acknowledge sort of the toxic atmosphere and the culture that's ingrained here, and here and in the local communities, as well as the international forces playing. I think it's very common in the region to say in history, so and so, this country or that. I don't know how far that gets us in the conversation.
Let me just add a point in emphasis about what Father was saying. We do a lot of polling, as you know, in the Middle East, and the one place where we actually can get numbers that are instructive is Lebanon, because the splits among the sectarian communities are so significant. We're not dealing with a 5% population. We're dealing with 30% here, 30%, 30%, etc. And what's very interesting in Lebanon is that the principal identity in the country, when we ask them what their principal identity is, it's not religion. It's being Lebanese. Mm-hmm. And when we ask them what kind of government system they want, they don't want one based on sect. They want one man, one vote. And when we ask them, and we ask them all the way up and down the line, the interesting thing is that the people of Lebanon agree, but the sectarian leadership does not agree because it's not in their interest, and they therefore find external patrons to support that line, to use them, as historically has been the case in Lebanon and other countries in the region, as their, in effect, their weapon in the country. It's a very divisive thing. It's happening again in other countries in the region, and that's what we have to be careful of. I call Lebanon is the reductio ad absurdum of sectarian politics, but the Lebanon model is being replicated in Iraq.
Yes.
It's now being advocated in Syria. It's being talked about elsewhere. And the danger is that it doesn't recognize where people in their own heads really are, but plays into the hands of this group on the elite level who use this for their political advantage. They don't represent where the constituencies that they claim to represent really are. Yes, we have something back here. Yes, and then you. Yeah.
Miriam Khan, Congressman Phil's office. Yeah. I wanted to turn the attention to Egypt, particularly in light of your comments about focusing on citizenship first as opposed to religion and other differences. In particular, members of the FJP were here last week meeting with various members all over the place. And I heard a lot of citizenship, equal opportunity for citizenship. I'm a little skeptical, though, of the FJP in light of the constitutional assembly that's going on, right? In particular, that only, I think, 2 seats were allocated to the Coptic community, and of course now the constitutional assembly is on pause at the moment as they try and figure out in what direction to go. Can you speak to what you think the future of Egypt, the future of the Coptic Church in Egypt is, and in particular keeping in mind the recent death of the Coptic Pope, which many have said was the figurehead for the entire church in Egypt and kind of had less some wondering who's going to be the leader.
Well, to begin with what you said about the Constitutional Committee, the parliamentary committee that was formed and in which the Ikhwan al-Muslimin or the Muslim Brotherhood took all the seats. Actually, even the Azhar, which is considered like the Vatican for the Muslim world, for the Sunni Muslim world, pulled out, withdrew, and criticized this. And also the Copts pulled out, and everybody pulled out. So what will happen, I don't think either myself or anybody else can answer to this question at the moment. The future, yes, is still unknown, unfortunately. We talk about citizenship because we hope through this to be able to create a new culture, a new way of thinking, to change mentalities in the area and start thinking as grown-ups, citizens, and as responsible people who really have rights and have duties, responsibilities, and are willing to pay the price when it is the right price. What's been happening in Egypt is very sad because as I began my intervention, different to all the expectations of the young people who created the revolution, who started out the revolution. Certainly, this wasn't their expectation or their hope. Going back to what they wrote and what they said, it goes against everything they stood up for. But it happened. We have to deal with it as it is, but we have to try to form a stronger coalition, not to oppose, rather to really dialogue and to arrive to a mutual understanding, because they also have the right to live and to exist and to be citizens. But we all have to exercise our citizenship in the right manner. That's...
Yes, a few comments. One on the Coptic Church. It's amazing how little we know about the Pope here in the States. But he was an incredible figure, and we only get to know him when he passed away. But when you saw him in action, he was an incredible, delicate person who really spoke about faith and its resilience in all times. He didn't focus on negative and the conflicts. He focused on what it means to be a Christian and what does that faith mean in all times. I think most of us who observe the Coptic Church really do see, wondering who the new Pope will be. The previous Pope was a person who brought people together, not only within his community but across the lines. But he also spoke in such ways that was calming. So I think, and he wasn't, he wasn't so nationalistic that he's only serving the interests of Copts. He really did think of serving himself as Egypt too. So I think whoever is brought in has big shoes to fill. And I personally am optimistic that while it's going through a lot of religious tensions, I don't think the Coptic community will be suffer a greater annihilation, as many people are predicting here in the States. The second thing is more of a step back, a reflection. It's only been a year and 2 months or 3 months. Everyone wants to microwave what happened into a week or a month. Everything has failed. You want Reformation, you want revolution and enlightenment and modernity and post-modernity in 6 weeks. This takes decades, if not centuries. And this was, and it's not a performance for the rest of the world. This is an Arab movement for Arab people. It's not done for anyone else, and they are really doing things for themselves. And I think if you look at other revolutions, whether it be the American Revolution, it took at least 6, 7 decades to really fully understand what an American democracy really meant, a republic meant. I think we should at least have the same sort of humility for other revolutions that are still undergoing. Even though we have these issues, people are making, the Salafis are in, and that's the end, the revolution's over, this is not what they wanted. I really do think we need to have a degree of perspective. These things it's a process. They unfold. And as they're unfolding, this is just one stage of that process. So that's that.
Back here? Yeah. And then you. Thanks. Yes?
My question is actually on an earlier comment, Mr. Zogby mentioned that American government can help provide assistance to Christian minorities. I'm just wondering, in the second point for the tool, you mentioned that the second or third funding for tool should be to build that the collective self-esteem through citizenship in the countries. I'm all for that, but I'm just wondering, to both of you, to what extent do you see the U.S. government supporting citizenship education programs in those countries? Is that a national program effort that they should work on themselves, or in some way, or the diaspora community, or the NGO world? Is that a better option for the cause?
I should think we have no business in that work at all. We want to fashion ourselves still the city on the hill, but we're not that in much of the world, in particular the Arab world. Too many years of Palestine, too many years of Iraq, too many years of everything else we've done in that region, and we are no longer seen as an exemplar. Number one. Number two, in all the polling that we do, when we ask people what their political priorities are, their top political concerns, you usually get a variation on economy, healthcare, and education as being in the top three. And in some countries, there will be political issues that are domestic, local, i.e. Unique, I mean, not domestic. Corruption in Egypt, nepotism in Lebanon, that kind of thing. But when we turn the question and then second set and say, of each of these issues, and we ask them one by one, where can America be helpful? Guess what comes number one? Solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which doesn't factor in on the top priorities on the rest of the list. But you say America and you say politics, and that's what they think. The next in order on the list are the economy, healthcare, and education. Democracy is nowhere to be found. Citizenship issues, nowhere to be found. Why? Because we don't belong there. That's not our business. It's like if during our healthcare debate, the Swedes opened an office here in town to help teach us how to do healthcare. Or during the handgun debate, the Brits came over and said, we can fix this for you because we don't have a handgun problem. Or if the Canadians came in to teach us how to do public healthcare systems, right? I mean, the point is that we are not seen as the solution. We're looked at as the problem. I was asked during the early part of the Egyptian Revolution by an NPR reporter, she said, wouldn't our favorable rating in Egypt go up if we dumped Mubarak? And I said, you've got it completely backwards. We're not unpopular in Egypt because we supported Mubarak. He's unpopular in Egypt because he supported us. He supported us in Iraq. He supported our policy with Gaza and Israel's war in Gaza. He made Egypt into a way station on the road to rendition. They tortured people that we didn't want to torture. We sent them to them, and they were our surrogates in the job. So we don't understand our role. We still want to see ourselves as the missionaries for democracy, but we've actually made it a tarnished word in too many places. Now, there are takers, to be sure. There are always going to be takers. But we've never learned to tell the difference between sycophancy and appreciation for our values. And that's something that the sort of the master-slave colonial, the dialectic here, we've never quite sorted out. And so I think humility is in order here. We need, the first thing we need, and I think the president got it absolutely right last May when he spoke at the State Department. If you listen to that speech about the Arab Spring, he said, we didn't start it, we didn't make it, and we can't finish it. It's theirs. And then he went on to list what we can do. And basically what he said we can do is help their economies and help build their capacity. That's what they want from us. And then finally he said we can help solve the Arab-Israeli conflict. I mean, the president got it completely right. And I listened to that speech and I said, in order for this to happen, he's got to get Congress. And I listened to that speech and I thought, this is not a speech for the Arab world. This is a speech to Congress saying, give us the budget we need to support assistance programs to Egypt. I mean, right now the biggest need in Egypt is not democracy. The biggest need in Egypt right now is jobs. The economy is in a state of complete collapse. And the trauma that this is creating is going to create another revolution, which may be a counter-revolution, as people say, we want the old days, when in fact we were able to feed our kids and find work. As bad as it was then, it was better then, economically speaking, than it is today. That's the part we don't get. That's what they want from us, but we want, like I said, we want to operate in the darkened room as if we can see where we're going, and we keep bumping into stuff, blaming it on the stuff. You know, anybody else want to comment on that?
I must agree with you. And
Don't hesitate.
Your
I
hands.
love it. No, I'm just kidding.
But it doesn't hurt also to start up some programs. But certainly we don't want to follow a model. See what I mean? We have to find the model our own selves. And I think here, I agree with what James is saying. And further, I'd say we need to model it our own selves. The Syrian way, the Lebanese way, the Egyptian way, the Iraqi way. Because to each country, although we are all the Arab world, but each country has its own particularities, its own characteristic, its own character. The people, the way the relations, how they grew up together, how they interact together, whatever. So it's very important to think of it this way. And certainly politically, if it starts well where it should, then all the problems will be resolved much faster. The Israeli Arab Palestinian crisis, if it's resolved, then I think we'll be halfway there, because this is now, if it's not for real, but at least so many are taking it as a alibi, to behave in the manner they choose to behave. Thank you.
Last question here, and then I'll take yours. We'll take them both because we're going to try to leave at quarter. Yeah.
My name is Jessica Deer, and my husband and I actually run an NGO in Lebanon called Social Media Exchange. So we're in DC now, and whenever we talk about democracy, we like to talk about self-determination. I think we use the word democracy a lot and not self-determination because it's sort of the same point that Dr. Zogby was making. But the question that I have is actually for Father Faddoul. And in Lebanon, even in Lebanon, we have you're talking a lot about citizenship and sort of the idea of every Lebanese being equal. But even in Lebanon, we don't have civil marriage, and we have civil codes according to your sect. And I don't know other Arab countries as well as I know Lebanon, but I think this isn't unique. Mm-hmm. So when you're talking about the Christian church and Christians sort of coming together, how is there an opportunity for the Christians to lead in removing that civil code that treats Maronites different from the Shia, different from the Sunni, and how could that be setting an example for the kind of model you want to see?
Can I just take your question in the back and then that'll be it? Yeah.
Sure. From Jackson's office. There's a question about lobbying internationally and how you balance that with, I guess, the narrative of minority groups being, the hand of foreigners, as the argument was made in Egypt.
Sure.
How do you balance those?
Okay. Father?
Well, thank you first, Jessica, for your question, which is very straightforward and correct. I think it's a package. It's a whole package. I'm not preaching one piece at a time. And that's why I talked about shared and common vision. I made a kind of a self-critique, but it's the same that goes right for the whole population, not only for the church leadership, for the whole leadership. But what I'm saying, in terms of civil rights and civil marriage, let's say, whatever, we have no problem with it as a Christian community. But our leadership had to stand by the Muslim leadership at the time, who refused it categorically, because we cannot split even over something like this. So we said, fine, if the Muslim leadership agrees, we have no problem, because we as Christians, it has been applied all over the world. There's no problem. And any other issue, what we are looking at for is to have really a unified vision around it. Now, in terms of citizenship, I don't think the national pact that exists in Lebanon contradicts with citizenship. Because by the same way that this national pact was created in 1943 to distribute roles and responsibilities among different confessions, among different communities, it could be revised and done differently. And the proof is the Taif agreement came and took out the substance out of things and said, okay, you Christian, you remain on top, but you are just an image. You do nothing. And that's what happened. However, the Taif agreement also is being accused of giving to the Sunnis more than anybody else. You see what I mean? So I think it should be. I'm just looking with a critical eye to things. What you're saying is it's a very good observation, but we need to look at the whole picture and work on a whole package. Not only citizenship cannot come in parcels. It has to be a whole package. As small as it is, it doesn't matter. We have to start somewhere, but I think that's how it should go. Thank you.
In terms of the last question, I was just thinking how to respond to it, because the last 10 years, if you think from international efforts to democratize the region, and there's clearly a democracy project and program in previous administration, from Iraq to Libya to Egypt and so forth. On one hand, some people say, look what we've done, and there's no space for any contribution. And the other side will not say, we definitely need your involvement. I think the best thing to think about is there's one thing to be counseling and supporting various countries and democratizing and helping themselves shape themselves. There's another mentality to think that you're navigating them. And I find that to be the mentality in so many policy communities, that we can't let this happen and leave this to them. We can't leave it to chance. And it's really a high degree of arrogance to think that Egyptians can't, write their own constitution. Well, it's really odd, because every other person is a lawyer or an engineer there. So they're very literate, and they know how to write constitutions. They know how to revise it. The question is, how can they translate it to a political reality, to a social reality? I think Dr. Zogby said it very clearly, that democracy is clearly an important project for them, but what's really an emergency is the social items, the jobs, the economy, and injustices. So I think that if we have any one place to add our voice, whether it be Libya or in Egypt and other places, is really to think about the social issues. And I think everything else will come to place, and not just being present and being supportive.
Thank you all for coming, and I appreciate the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, James. Thank you very much.